kalpatarubhyascha kripachandraveva patitana pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dhanavad Pranam Prabhus, Didis, Maharajas, friends. So I decided, for various reasons. One reason is because I've been trying to do this for quite some time, and neither time nor facility has really been aligned in such a way that I could get it done. And that is to write a book, or a small book, about the nature of the pioneering of the preaching in Africa, in particular in West Africa. I am also feeling void a little bit, because I think an integral part of even narrating it as I'm doing now, I would love to have many of those devotees who were integral to the activities that I'm about to describe. Especially Pujapad Bhaktivedanta Shanta Maharaj. He is a lifelong friend. I will describe actually how we met and everything, but he was such an integral part from the very beginning of at least my experience with preaching in Africa. And it would be nice if I was doing this with him, and I'm sure there'll be some time in the future when we'll narrate some things together. But I didn't want to, just inspiration hit me that I should try to begin that process, and so this is that humble attempt. So basically, maybe some background is apropos to set things up of how I came into that position in the very first place. And one of the things that about myself, which is I think just a interesting backdrop, is that my path into bhakti itself was pretty interesting. I had an uncle who taught yoga throughout the early 50s in Cleveland, Ohio. And he came to live with us in New York. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio also, but in my early life I moved to New York, and this uncle came to live with us, very shortly afterwards. I'm going to try to turn the camera around and actually show you a picture of that uncle. So I have to move the camera a little bit. And that is my Uncle Leon. He was a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, and he had mastered the practice of Kriya Yoga and was teaching in Cleveland, Ohio back in the very early 50s. And he came from Cleveland to live with us in New York, and of course, began teaching myself and my elder brother and my other sisters as well. I have two older sisters, and one of them, also started taking to the practice. He kind of just was teaching the kids in general. And so he was my introduction into yoga and the philosophy of yoga, because he wasn't just a Hatha Yoga teacher, though he was quite excellent at Hatha Yoga, but he also had done a deep study of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and he was studying the course of Science of Self-Realization under the auspices of the Self-Realization Fellowship. And of course, we know in Bhakti there's differences because of the Brahmavad or Mayavad that is intrinsic to the path normally taught in yoga organizations that had come here to America versus Bhakti and what was given by our tradition coming from Mahaprabhu. But still, at a very young age, that sanskar, those impressions were very, 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 very important and very, very instrumental, probably, undoubtedly rather, in my growth in coming to the path of Bhakti. In fact, I'll tell a story a little bit going forward about how he was also the catalyst for me going to the ISKCON temple in the very beginning. So we might as well move into that. In 1972, we were living in Brooklyn, New York, and the temple at that time was located at 439 Henry Street in Brooklyn. And my uncle, I was, in my teenage years then, and he had a question regarding the disappearance Leela of Krishna, which is called Mosala Leela. Neither one of us knew that term at the time. He just wanted to know, well, how did Krishna leave the world, and what's the story on that? So I looked up, I knew there was a temple in Brooklyn, so I looked up the phone number, we 411 at that time, and got the phone number and called the temple and asked the question. And the devotee who had answered the phone explained that, well, we don't discuss that openly, for one, and for two, you would be better served to come and get the books, and in the books, even that question can be answered. So I while on the phone, explained the same to my uncle, that this devotee was suggesting we get the books, and the books would, serve your question and tell us many other things. So my uncle then said, okay, well, hang up, and I hung up with that devotee, and we called a gypsy cab. Now, gypsy cab back at that time was the Uber of the day. Uber or Lyft of the day was called a gypsy cab. So we called a gypsy cab. They generally would come to your house, pick you up, take you to a destination. If you needed to return, they would do that as well. So he gave me money to both purchase the books and pay the cab, and took a cab over to the Henry Street Temple. And of course, this was my first experience in a temple at all. I walked in, and of course, for those devotees who had been to Henry Street, when you walk into the building, the temple room is right to your left. There's a staircase in the front that goes upstairs to a gift shop. So I first went in, and well, first let me say that the combination of the Raj Bhog, which was about to be offered, which was being prepared downstairs, the incense, and the colors and everything else about my first darshan of Radha Govinda was completely amazing. And then I went up on the second floor to a gift shop where I was able to acquire the books that we wanted to have, and or what was given to me. I didn't really know exactly what books were going to be suitable to try to answer my uncle's questions and all that. But they gave us Bhagavad Gita, they gave us Krishna book, what she said in Krishna book you could probably find this answer. And I think some other books, I can't exactly remember what was available at that time. But I came back downstairs, went back in the temple room, and I took a special note. As I mentioned, I believe, and I'm from memory, so I'm just giving as best I can. But as you exited, I believe the picture of Sri Narasimha Bhagavan with Hiranyakashipu on his lap in the bifurcation was there. And I remember thinking everything that I had seen in the temple, Shishiyara Govindaji, the beauty of many of the other BBT artwork was there. But when I walked out and saw that, I was thinking, wow, is this what happens when you try to leave? I don't know. Anyway, so returning home, I gave the books to my uncle, and he said, well, did they say where to find this? And so, no, so we both looked through the books for some time. We didn't really find exactly what we were looking for. Later on, of course, he read Krishna book, and of course, the Mosala Leela is something that's very deep, and it's not something that would have been gleaned easily from just simply reading a book anyway. But the point is, the Sukriti that had come from just that endeavor and everything was helpful to both of us. For me, it was the beginning of a substantive relationship with Krishna consciousness, and with my uncle, it was also a elevation, so to speak, of his practice of yoga and dealing with yoga philosophy and everything else, now to have an introduction to the path of bhakti. So, long story short, my uncle stayed with us for many, many years, and he continued to teach me and my brother especially. And as I got older in my teenage years, yoga and all of that became fashionable more for, whatever application I had for it in my athletics and whatever brownie points it would get me with girls and other kinds of things to have something hip to talk about. But it wasn't very deep. But I did start to go to the temple on a regular basis then, and I did start to develop a deep appreciation of Srila Prabhupada's movement, Krishna consciousness. I bought more books. I met one of my neighborhood friends there. His name was Arthur Rames. He was an incredible musician, incredible martial artist, of both things of which I was into. And we also spent a lot of time together around the temple, and I felt even more encouraged by the fact that someone from the neighborhood was also there. But anyway, long story short, I never broke which you can't do anyway. I never really broke ties with interest or trying to push forward in bhakti from that time onward. So fast forward, after a period of time, I decided to go into the military, and so I think it was around 1973 or something, I went into the Air Force. And while I was in the Air Force, I continued studying and looking at things regarding Krishna consciousness, and the thirst just became deeper and deeper. You know, obviously, as you're reading Srila Prabhupada's books, and you know, I didn't have a chance to early in the basic training or in my schooling in the Air Force, I didn't have a chance to do anything. But once I was situated at an Air Force base upstate New York in Plattsburgh, I enrolled in college for one, and then for two, you know, I kept studying Bhagavad Gita and other things. And interestingly enough, while I was there at the university, State University up there, there was someone I met who was also from Brooklyn, and him and his fiance at the time were very much in the spiritual life. So it was like just a natural conduit to continue this deepening of this study of Bhagavad Gita and other, because that's all I really have was Bhagavad Gita, I think, and a few other books, but just continue my study in bhakti, and also just paralleling it with other kinds of spiritual teachings, which the friend of mine who I'm telling you about, I was pretty steeped in. He was pretty steeped in Taoist philosophy and all these things, and he was a martial artist as well, so we had a connection there. Anyways, after that, I came out of the military, and at that time I decided, you know, I came back to New York, and I began a musical career. I don't want to leave that. I began a musical career, and that kind of became, I don't know, kind of overwhelming. I transferred to another college, and many of the students at the college with me, they were also musicians, so we mutually were growing as a musical community. We're actually working, getting jobs, recording, getting tied into various bands with known artists and all these things. So that started to become a pretty full part of my life, and I decided that I was making enough money to move away from home and, you know, kind of strike out on my own and all of that. And interestingly enough, when I moved away from home, my uncle decided to come with me. And that made my mom feel, you know, quite good, because now I wasn't just going to be, I think it was around, I don't know how old I was anyway, but I was pretty young, and my mother was happy that I wasn't just going to be out on my own in an apartment simply because I was making money to be able to do it. So my uncle continued to, you know, be a philosophical influence in my life and so forth, but now we were both involved in studying bhakti. And I decided at a certain point that I wanted to make a much deeper investment into the practice of bhakti. Reading books and those sort of things is one thing, but the literal practice of bhakti, living in an ashram environment, having a sort of 24-hour schedule built around Krishna consciousness, that's different. And I wanted to have the experience of that. So while I was on a summer break from college, I kind of put out notice to all of the, you know, sort of musical community that I had been involved in, that I was going out to California, I was going to take a little bit of a break. So one of the things that was a little bit, for me, a jeopardy then was I was getting a stipend from the military, obviously under the GI Bill to go to school, but a good part of the money that I was making to live was coming from playing music. And so I was a little bit worried, because obviously anyone who knows the musical business in New York, whatever instrument you play, there's probably 1,000 other people who play that instrument, and your availability is a big criteria in your being hired to work. So I felt a little apprehension, but I was determined that I wanted to experience Krishna consciousness as a absorbed part of my life. And I felt that the only way to do that was to go into the ashram. So I gave a friend of mine most of my instruments to hold, because I was going to temporarily, my uncle moved back into my mom's house, and, you know, I kind of gave up the apartment. And I went out to LA, and I think that was 1975. And while I was out in Los Angeles, that was the first Bhakta program that they had. And it was run by Dhanavir Das, who's obviously Pujapad Dhanavir Maharaj now. And he had the first Bhakta program. There were many stalwart devotees in that program. I don't want to start naming names, because there was just a lot of them. And, you know, some of them have actually left our association. So, you know, a shout out or a dandavat to all of those devotees who were stalwart disciples of Srila Prabhupada, who were in that first Bhakti program there in New York out in LA. So I stayed there and, of course, went through the Bhakti program and was following all the regimens. I was very happy. My life seemed very simplified. It came time for consideration about initiation. I had already missed the semester, by the way, because I had stayed there, I think, over past the time of school. But anyway, the next semester had come around, and I had a choice to make, because if you miss a certain amount of time, then obviously the GI stipend stops, because you have to, you know, be accountable for that stipend they're giving you to go to school. So anyway, at least it was like that at that time. But anyway, also what had happened during that time was that obviously you had to write a letter to Srila Prabhupada to be initiated. So I had done that. I had done that, and maybe, I don't know, a week or something later, this sort of, I don't want to say it was a crisis, but this decision popped up that I had to make up my mind to go back to school in order to keep my stipend, because I was not getting paid from playing music, and I was not yet fully under the ideal that I would just stay and live an ashram life, etc., etc. So anyway, long story short, I decided, you know, perhaps that I needed to go back and maybe finish school. I don't know what I was thinking was going to be the outcome, but anyways, I made that decision. I had a talk with the vice president of the temple at that time, who told me, listen, if you leave, obviously, we would have to withdraw your initiation letter, because you can't be initiated and live outside the temple. Now, of course, that was in 1975. Things drastically changed from that time, obviously. And also probably some immaturity on my part, that I thought I would be able to go back, live in New York in an apartment somewhere, playing music full time and trying to go to school and practice bhakti in any significant way. So I didn't have any, I did have some remorse and regret, because I genuinely wanted to be initiated by Srila Prabhupada, but I didn't have any animosity towards the temple or anything, because I thought, yeah, this makes sense. I mean, people are very serious here, people are dedicating their lives here, and it's not something that is a Sunday to Sunday religion. It's a lifestyle, and it's an absorption. So understanding that, I went back to school, and as soon as I got back in school and I was back in New York, I got a sort of a ton of calls. Oh, you're back, do you want to work, many of my friends who were in school with me at the time, they were working like anything, and they, hey, yeah, you're back, you should get into this. So long story short, I got so involved in music during that time that I ended up leaving school and becoming a full-time musician. So during the course of that time in New York, things seemed like they were pretty rosy. I had the advantage of having, my brother had a business, so I had access to money in two ways. So I was making a living, things were fine. I was working pretty much doing music, you know, almost from day to night. I would do TV commercials and recordings in the morning at studios. And then later on in the afternoon, I would do rehearsals if I was working with a band or anything. Later in the evening, if I did not have rehearsal, I would play dance classes at a very famous dance studio called Clark Center on 8th Avenue in New York. My uncle was a pretty famous dancer, and he had gotten me involved in that community. So that was another avenue of income and musical expression for me. So anyways, long story short, I would do that on a regular. Now, as part of that, I would also go to take darshan of Radha Govinda Dev, but now they were in the 55th Street Temple. And I would go every day and take darshan, and they also had Govinda's restaurant downstairs, which was amazing. So pretty much daily, my lunch and dinner routines were to figure out my work schedule for the day and make sure I get up for both lunch and for dinner at Govinda's. So that went on for some years. And then I met someone and became involved in, who was my first wife, actually. And I continued that program of working and going to the temple and so forth and so on. In 1979, I'm trying to speed things up to get to the crux of what we're discussing, which is preaching in Africa. But in 1979, I went to Govinda's one night, as I usually did, and a devotee came downstairs and said, hey, Brahmananda and His Holiness Bhakti Tirtha Swami would like to speak to you. So I only remembered Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, that when I was in the Bhakti program in Los Angeles, his name was Ghanashyam Prabhu at that time. He was very, very well respected and very well adored for his library party work. And I was one day working at the BBT warehouse, helping out, doing something or another, and he came there. And for me, that was like a huge thing because it was like a movie star or something in the Krishna conscious arena coming. And so I went and I put down everything and I went to just try to see him. I didn't talk to him or anything. I just went to try to see who is this person and everything else. And of course, he was an African-American body, and I felt very, proud of how much respect and everything everyone had for him. And, so now that person and Brahmananda Swami, who I'd heard about obviously from his history in the early days of the movement, they wanted to speak to me. So I went upstairs and I went in and paid my obeisances, and Brahmananda looked at me with like this huge smile, sort of like, okay, we got him, kind of thing. And I wasn't really sure what was going on. Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj spoke to me and he said, listen, I'm looking to do some outreach preaching and to do some projects. I understand that you are a musician, you have some contacts in the community and so forth and so on. And we're also doing preaching in Africa, and we are asking people to donate and help out to get books for Africa. And he explained something about the Books for Africa program. So both things, of course, I was immediately ready to do. So I was ready to give a donation. And then I also went out and arranged some programs. I remember one program we arranged at a very famous sort of Afrocentric bookstore in Harlem, which was called the Tree of Life. And I think I arranged another program at the National Black Theater or something like that. Anyway, so I arranged some programs and kept some connection. At that time, I was, of course, with someone, and I went and I spoke to that person that, I felt very inspired on a number of levels about rededicating myself to Krishna consciousness full time and kind of living ashram life and so forth. And, we're together, so obviously this is a discussion that we need to have. I felt like my musical career, so to speak, was okay, everything was all right, but, just probably the nature of the early Sukriti of being around Bhakti was kicking in, and I just was feeling more inspiration to dedicate my life to devotional practice than to try to maintain this material life thing. So anyways, after speaking to that person, she amazingly said, okay, well, listen, she was an executive that time for a company in New York, and she said, well, listen, I don't have much experience with living in the ashram. She had belonged to another spiritual organization back at that time. It was kind of a Mayavadi organization as well. But she said, well, let me get the experience of what it would be like. There's a temple here. I'll go and spend the weekend in the temple here in New York to see what it's like living in the ashram. So I said, okay, that's fine. So she went to spend the weekend in the New York temple there at 55th Street. And she called me on the Sunday and said, well, listen, I need to get a better perspective because, I stayed in the temple over the weekend. I was off, but I want to know what it's going to be like if I'm living in a temple and trying to go to work and so forth and so on. So I'm going to stay and see what that's like. So I said, okay. So she stayed for some days and so forth. And then she said, yeah, I think we should try to live in the temple. So then one issue arose, and it was an issue that had also been part of my earlier decision to go to LA, which was that I had so many connections in New York, and my phone was always so busy in terms of music and everything. And there was always somebody contacting me about music work and everything. I just felt it would be a great distraction to try to stay here and at the same time try to dedicate my life. So at that time, I took my instruments and I did not tell a friend to hold them. I actually sold my instruments to a friend and invited the devotees of the temple to come and, you could clean out my apartment and I'll donate my stuff to the temple. And interestingly enough, a very wonderful senior disciple of Srila Prabhupada, His Grace Purudas, he came with a party including Pranadas and I think a couple of other devotees who I can't remember to move the furniture from my house and take whatever donations that were going to be usable by the temple. So I remember Puru came in and he was more directing people than actually moving furniture, but he would be someone who later on in my life, we became very, very close, and he was very, very inspirational on so many levels. So, but anyway, at that time, I gave everything kind of to the temple, and anything that was left over, friends and relatives came and got. So the person I was with decided, yeah, we'll go ahead and make this trek out to Los Angeles. So I went back out to Los Angeles. This is 1979. Srila Prabhupada, of course, in 77 has already entered Samadhi, so I didn't really know what the atmosphere would be like. But I decided to go, and once I arrived in LA again, I went back into a Bhakta program, believe it or not. One devotee who lives here in Alachua, Harikatha, he was in charge of the program, and I said, yeah, I'm not prideful, and I've already been through this program or something, and I've been living in the, essentially in secular life for some time. So yes, let me, try to dedicate myself to the schedule and everything else. So we were doing that. My wife, at the time, she had a connection with the ladies, and she began going on Sankirtan, and that was working out, and everything was going well. But there was something very, very much missing for me in the difference between what I experienced in 1975 and what was going on now. And I don't think that was anything to do with the temple as much as it was to do with perhaps some restlessness in me that I made such a huge transition in my life, sort of overnight, and all these things. And I was looking for more of a comfort zone, so to speak, and more of where would I fit in. Is there something I could do in Krishna consciousness, which was more like my niche and so forth, so on. Anyway, so I had kept contact, obviously, with Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj at that time, and I remember going out to a payphone on, I can't remember the big street that's in, not Wateka Boulevard, but maybe it is Wateka Boulevard, the huge avenue where there's a hospital there. I remember going to a phone booth in that hospital and calling DC and speaking to His Holiness Bhakti Tirtha Swami and telling him, well, I came out to LA and I'm not really feeling as comfortable here, and I just wanted to get your advice and maybe some encouragement. And he said, well, Krishna consciousness is not easy, and that you have to surrender, but I don't want to tell you to do anything that's not Vaishnava. But if you can, yourself and your partner, you should take a bus and come back here and come to Washington, D.C. I've just started a project. So, in a very subtle way, that was like a okay in my eyes to sort of leave the Bhakti program there and go back out to the East Coast, back to D.C., and obviously be under the auspices and guidance of Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj. So I felt, oh, this is great. I explained it to the temple authorities there. They obviously were not happy because, money, manpower, and facility are part of preaching, and, no matter who somebody is or how insignificant they are, you don't want people just, leaving if you can hold on to them. So anyways, we did that. We caught a bus and, took a whole bus trip across the country again and arrived in Washington, D.C., and went to Govinda's restaurant, which was on Southeast 8th Street in Washington, D.C., right near Capitol Hill. It was a project that Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj had just started, along with another boutique, which was run by two early, very great helpers of Srila Prabhupada, and one, my godbrother, Srila Sanatana Goswami Das, and Madan Gopal Prabhu. Both were in the beginning helping Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj establish this place there in Washington, D.C. They were collecting, and they were going out, and they had a boutique and a jewelry business and other things. So they were kind of financing things and making it work. And they were making the restaurant work because they hired one of the best cooks. I won't say hired, but maybe he was just there. Pankaj Prabhu was very, very famous in ISKCON as a cook. He was cooking at the Govindas. This is going to be important as I get to another part of the story. But anyway, he was cooking at the restaurant. The restaurant was doing extremely well. You had everybody from, Senate and Congress members coming there, to business people, to the community, neighborhood people. So you had a huge swath of the community on all levels coming in and patronizing this Govinda's restaurant. So extremely successful. We maintained a pretty strict regular temple program. We had Mangalarti every day downstairs. We would, before the restaurant opened, we would have it in this little area, which we had as a little temple area. And then we would clean up, straighten everything up for the restaurant, and then Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, we regularly went on Harinam, all the different temple programs. But then he would have us do various services, if we needed to help out at the boutique, or we needed to, my wife would go on Harikatha at that time, just different things. So one day, which is now fast forwarding to the crux of what this little series of discussions is about, we came down and we had our regular morning program, and we were about to begin Srimad Bhagavatam class, and Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj would give class in the mornings. He would always start naturally with, Jaya Radha Madhava. So he took the kartals and he said, Jaya Radha. Before I forget, before I say anything, I just wanted to let you know, Akindra, and my name was Akindra at that time, Akindra and Papa Staya, I'm going to send you to the festival in Mayapur, and then you're going to go to Africa to preach. Jaya Radha Madhava. And he just continued like in one flow. Like there was no questions and answers. There wasn't a discussion. There wasn't like, when is this going to happen? How is it going to happen? Who's going? Is my, at that time, wife going? I mean, what's the details on this? So none of that was there. So after the class, he explained a little more, and he explained it for the benefit of all the devotees. He mentioned that he had a dream. He had gone to Africa, by the way, prior to that. And he said that he had a dream, and in the dream, Srila Prabhupada had come to him. And Srila Prabhupada was seated, and he said he was in a room with Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada was telling him to open the door. They're waiting for me. So he said that Srila Prabhupada, repeated it, and then he repeated it a third time with emphasis, open the door, they're waiting for me. So he said he got up and he opened the door, and he said it was like thousands and thousands of people were coming in. So he said that he digested that dream as Srila Prabhupada telling him, because I think on his first trip to Africa was just more of an invitation to Brahmananda Swami and a preaching sort of trip, but he was going to dedicate himself now and dedicate his efforts and manpower and facilities to actually preaching in Africa. So there have been devotees who had been there. I think Niham Dyapi, maybe Mahanidhi Swami, I think had also gone. One devotee, Jalakar Prabhu, had certainly gone through West Africa, I believe. Certainly, I'll describe Central Africa much later on, but he definitely had gone there. And devotees had definitely already gone to Kenya. In fact, the temple had been established in Kenya. And in fact, I remember two people that I spoke to right before I was going to board the plane in a couple of days, because I went to New York to take my flight. But let me finish this first part first. At that time, Bhakti Tamar says, from that dream, he was convinced that Srila Prabhupada wanted him to take that kind of role in preaching in West Africa. So he then explained to me that, I'm going to send you to the Mayapur festival. You'll be very enlivened. Obviously I was looking forward to something like that. You'd be very encouraged. And he said, Papa Staya will go with you. But when everything shaked out, Papa Staya for some reason could not go. And Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj decided, well, listen, you'll get a chance to go to India for sure, but I think we should not hold up on beginning the preaching work in Africa. Brahmananda had been writing and saying, I thought you're sending somebody, Also, because of the nature of the facilities there, no ladies could go. So obviously that my wife at the time could not go, and it was not a large place we were staying in, so they didn't want to send too many people. So he said, well, listen, you can go by yourself. And so I said, okay. I started thinking, listen, I remember a time in my life when I was super excited about African culture and drumming and everything. So I was also saying, well, listen, this will be a chance by Krishna's arrangement within the course of bhakti for me even see all the things that I was involved in musically. I'll be seeing them firsthand, the nature of drumming in Africa. So there was like a mixed thing going on, obviously, in my heart. So I went to New York, and I was getting prepared to go. Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, by the way, when all was said and done, I had a one-way ticket, right? And, at that time, it was like a roll of the dice because, you could go to some places on a one-way ticket. They say, if you don't have a return ticket, then, we're not letting you in. But I had a one-way ticket and I had 10 US dollars. One-way ticket and 10 US dollars. Anyway, so what I was thinking, well, I'm going to go there. And, Brahmananda Swami's there. There's a facility there. There's a temple like there. So, even though it's an apartment, it's like a temple. And so what do I need money for, really, in one sense? Anyways, I went to the temple, 55th Street, and I remember speaking to Bhagavat Maharaj. He wasn't sannyasi at that time. Of course, he's Pujapad Bhagavat Maharaj now. He had been to Africa preaching, and he told me how it was, and he gave me great encouragement. He had not been to West Africa, but he had been preaching in East Africa and Central Africa. Also, there was a Gaudiya Mat sannyasi who was staying in the temple at that time. His name was Mangala Maharaj. And he was a very elderly, not very elderly, but elderly. And I had very high regard for him because he was so quiet, so seemingly absorbed always. So I always, had a deep kind of respect for him. And I mentioned to Maharaj, oh Maharaj, I'm going to be going now to Africa to preach. And so he was very happy. He said, oh, you will preach Mahaprabhu's movement in Africa. You preach Mahaprabhu's movement in Africa? I said, yes, Maharaj, yes, Maharaj. And he was giving me a blessing. Yeah, I wish all success for you there. Everything will be okay. You will be safe, everything. So I felt very encouraged by that as well. Fast forward, I'm at the airport. And I'm about to take a flight to Africa. So many things are going through my mind. I'm extremely happy, extremely excited. And I'm also in a deep mood of surrender because I'm thinking I have no idea what I'm going into, no idea what even the flight is going to entail, which I began to find. It was just like going to India. It was quite a long flight, but it was not a disturbed flight. There was no turbulence. There was no major issues. The plane makes its first landing in Dakar, in Senegal. And they let passengers off, and of course, in Senegal, that time, Dakar, the disembarking was right onto the tarmac, and then you get on a bus and so forth. So I couldn't disembark because my destination was Lagos, Nigeria. But I went to the door and looked out, and immediately, when the plane opened, that sort of flow of warm African air hit you, and the smell of the, sort of tropical environment, everything. So it was, like a very enlivening sensory experience. And I was also thinking, I'm here, I'm in Africa on behalf of Mahaprabhu. And also a thought came in my mind because many, many years ago, when my uncle was living with me, I was going through a phase of Afrocentricity, and I was reading all these books on Afrocentricity, Frantz Fanon, all these different things. And I remember him telling me, if you would put as much effort into studying spiritual things, you could do so many more things regarding even helping the African community, African American community. So I was partway listening and partway being dismissive. No, he doesn't understand the dynamics and social justice issues and all these things. But then that thought came back to me. Now here I am, some years later, arriving in Africa, and my entire mission here is going to be to preach spiritual doctrine of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So that thought came back to me, and I became a little overwhelmed. I was very moved by thinking, that was an indirect blessing from him, that I took whatever seeds of social justice and all of that and morphed it into actually trying to change consciousness and be an agent of consciousness changing by teaching and preaching for my own edification for one, but for the benefit of others, also the teachings of Sriman Mahaprabhu. So I arrived in Lagos and of course, went through all the normal transitions of worrying about whether or not I'm going to get in. Went up to the customs agent, you bringing anything, so forth, so on. But then my biggest worry was at immigration because I only had a one-way ticket. So I got to immigration, the person looked at the one-way ticket, because I gave him the ticket. He asked me for my papers, tickets, everything. So I gave him that. He said, well, this is only a ticket to Nigeria. It's a one-way ticket. Do you have your other ticket? And so I said, no, my sponsors, came in my mind, my sponsors here, I think they're providing for that. He says, who are your sponsors? I said, the Hare Krishna temple. I said temple. We didn't have a temple. I said Hare Krishna temple, right? And he said, Hare Krishna temple? What is that? So then I start trying to explain and preach. Meanwhile, there's a line gathering behind me. So I think he got to a point where he says, okay, I got to make a decision on this. And next thing I know, boom, okay, go ahead in. So I was like completely relieved that I wasn't going to be being put on a plane going directly back to America because I had a one-way ticket. I get my baggage and I go outside and I've got the address to the flat or small apartment that we're staying in. And I get to the cab stand and request from the cab driver, here's the paper, right? I'm going to Bob's Animasham in Suralere, right? And I gave him the address, everything. And so he said, okay, go ahead and get in. And one thing I noticed, the taxi was a Peugeot, which is, I don't know, there's not that many Peugeots in America, but it's a really nice car. And as I looked outside, I also saw that there were so many like really high-class cars, everything from Range Rovers to Mercedes. So I was thinking, well, this is definitely not probably Africa as people imagine Africa or think Africa is anyway. Like this was, everybody was really dressed, to the nines. Everybody had on all this very expensive jewelry and people were extremely wealthy. Now, of course, that time, 1979, was the oil boom in Nigeria. So, that would certainly explain, the sort of open display of wealth and everything else that I saw. Anyway, I got in the cab and I'm waiting for the driver and it's like, okay, 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed. I'm like, okay, what's up? So I get out of the cab. I'm like, give the hands up like, are we going? What's going on? He said, no, patient, be patient. And then I saw him talking to other people. Next thing I know, this other couple is coming and I'm a big guy, but I was much smaller than I am now. And these two ladies are getting in the back of the cab and they were sizable, I'll put it that way. And the gentleman, he was getting in the front. So I was like, well, first of all, I'm trying to digest what this is. I hired a cab and now there's like 3 other people in the cab. So of course I didn't know it at that time, but a taxi can fill up and then run multiple destinations. So that's not anything unusual. I'd seen that in Europe when I was traveling in Europe as well. But anyway, so he dropped the other people off and then he finally arrived at my destination and I got out, my baggage was in the trunk and I gave him the $10 US dollars. I said, will this be okay? He said, well, where's the rest of the fare? So I said, no, I gave you US dollars. I mean, this is, my, puffed upness, for lack of a better word. Yeah, I gave you US dollars. So now he's saying, no, this doesn't cover the fare. And I'm thinking, okay, he's trying to cheat me, but he's not going to be cheating me because I don't have any more money, right? So then, as, he starts speaking a little louder, a pretty heavy-set Indian gentleman comes out from the gate of the flat where we are, and he says, what's going on? So I explained to him, I gave him 10 US dollars and he's trying to get more money from me. I came from the airport. So then he went over and talked to the cab driver and, did talk. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but then he told him, open the trunk. He took my bags out of the trunk and he said, okay, and the cab driver took off and said, okay, leave it. Don't worry about it. Right? So then he came up to me and said, listen, in Nigeria, US dollars, it takes 2 US dollars to make 1 naira. So essentially, you just took a $5 cab ride, which is normally a $20 cab ride from the airport. So he was not wrong, you were wrong, right? So then, I said, oh, okay, oh my gosh, I felt very apologetic. Of course, the cab driver's gone by that time. So this gentleman, he invites me, listen, the Swami told me you were coming. He's referring to Brahmananda Swami. He's out with another gentleman. They went downtown to sell some books. You're welcome to come and sit. It's hot outside. Bring your bags. Come sit in my apartment. I'm downstairs from him. And you can wait till he comes back. So I went and I got into the apartment and he offered me a seat. And it looked like practically like a massage chair. It was just a huge recliner type chair. It wasn't a massage chair, but it just looked like one because it was like huge. So I sat down in the massage chair and he said, listen, I'm going to make something to eat. You're welcome, after I finish cooking. So I'm sitting in the chair, and of course, I grew up in the West. So suddenly this waft of the smell of dead flesh comes through the living room, and I'm like, it's hot, there's, mosquitoes, all that's going on, and then there's this stench of like cooking dead flesh or whatever. So he comes out with a hunk of whatever kind of meat it was, I couldn't even tell, on his plate with some sabji of some sort on the plate as well. He says, would you like anything? And I'm like, doing everything I possibly can not to, throw up and everything. And at the same time trying to be polite and tell him, well, no, I had some prasadam that I bought and I took it on the plane and so forth and so on. And we're vegetarian, by the way. He said, oh, yeah, that's right. I know the Swami is vegetarian and so forth and so on. Well, don't let it, don't let me stop you. If you want something, I'll get you something. And then he said, well, if you don't eat the meat, I can give you some of the vegetables. And I was thinking, no way. Just no way this is going to happen. So he actually went into another room and he was eating. I'm sitting and I'm waiting for Brahmananda Swami to come back from, I guess, their book distribution. And then I noticed some like movement in the chair, because this is what made me think it was a massage chair also. It was kind of moving and the cushions were kind of moving. So I'm like, well, what's, all right. I didn't push any buttons or anything. There are no buttons on here. What's going on? Then with a kind of suddenness, over my shoulder, a lizard comes running and runs down the front. So needless to say, I wasn't, in the midst of a huge amount of wildlife in Brooklyn, New York, or in Washington, D.C. for that matter. So, of course, my response was to jump up on the chair, which then gave cue to all the other lizards and a few other things which were in the chair to start making their exit. So I'm like, okay, I'm good. So I told him, listen, I'm a little warm. I'm going to wait outside. So I remember going outside. I took one of my suitcases. I sat on my suitcase and I was waiting for Brahmananda, which, grace of Krishna, Brahmananda, very shortly, about 15 minutes later, he pulls up and gets out of the small Daihatsu van that they had, and he's with another devotee. This is actually not a devotee at that time. His name was Bhakta Martin. That Bhakta Martin, this was the first time we're meeting, but Bhakta Martin, just to let you know, he is who is now Pujapad Srila Bhaktivedanta Shanta Maharaj. So that was our first meeting. And we sort of bonded from that very, very first day in that courtyard of that flat in Nigeria. We bonded right then and there. And I just had such a good feeling about, his association and us becoming friends. And Brahmananda said, okay, come on up to the flat and everything. And Bhakta Martin was telling me, hey, well, I've got to go. I've been out all day. I've got to go and start to prepare at home. And I've got to work in the morning. But I'll come back in the evening and I'll treat you to dinner. I'll come back and I will cook dinner tonight. So I said, okay, that sounds great. Meanwhile, I went up the stairs with Brahmananda Prabhu, and he was giving me the blow-by-blow on how we function in Nigeria. So as we got to the top of the stairs, there were two huge barrels. They're called jerry cans in Nigeria, but it's two huge barrels full of water. So he told me, listen, there's many times we don't have running water. So we use these two barrels. One, we go ahead and boil water for drinking and everything else and cooking. And then the other barrel, we use that for flushing the toilet and all these kind of things. So I was thinking, okay, here's the start of the austerities and everything else. So then we got into the flat, and Brahmananda was clean and everything, but it was pretty austere. It was pretty austere, and there was two rooms. Brahmananda had one room. He put me in the other room, and then we had the living room. But in the living room, it was filled, literally filled almost to the ceiling with books. And these were books that had been donated by different temples under a program called Books for Africa, which Srila Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj was working that program in America, and they would send books to Africa, and that would be our means of distributing books to libraries and to different people and so forth and so on. But the living room where our temple was, it was a small little altar, was filled with books. So, of course, we began trying to sort everything out, what the schedule would be and things like that. I realized this is getting a little bit long, so I think I'll pick up the first experience that night, maybe on the next installment. But anyway, I had a long talk with Brahmananda about what would be our strategy, and He gave me an introduction to his own arrival in Nigeria. He told me how when he first arrived, he had nowhere to stay. And that he literally took a taxi, and the taxi took him to a hotel because he asked, listen, I need to stay somewhere for the night. And he didn't really want to spend money, but he had no choice. You couldn't just sleep in the street. So the cab driver took him to a place called Apapa Wharf. Now, Apapa Wharf in Nigeria at that time was like still is, where shipping goes on and receiving and all of that. And it's a well-known place of ill repute in terms of prostitution, all that kind of stuff. Brahmananda said, he didn't know what the situation was then, and he went to this hotel. He took a room. He thought, well, it's pretty strange. It's obviously pretty seedy, right? So he said he locked himself in his room, everything. But he said it was so hot. And also, he kind of picked up that there's a lot of like very not Krishna conscious things going on here. He said, listen, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to cool off for one and get out of the immediacy of this environment. And what he did was he went to the roof of that hotel, took some covers, and he was going to sleep on the roof because it would be a little more of a breeze and everything. You're going to get mosquito attacks, but he could deal with that as opposed to the stench and the heat of the room he was in. So he said when he went up on the roof, he was able to realize at that time by the comings and goings of everything that he could see from the vantage point of the roof that it was like a hotel for prostitution. So he said he was already stuck there. The cab driver was gone. So he said that was my introduction to my first night in being in Nigeria. So I should consider myself, he was saying I should consider myself blessed that my first night's experience would be in a place where Srila Prabhupada's books filled the room. I had a place to lay my head, and I was about to embark on a chance to serve the prophecy of Mahaprabhu, to preach the mission of Mahaprabhu all over the world, which in this case, that part of the world would be Africa. So I think it's starting to get really, really long, and I think I could pick up maybe on the next installment. I certainly want to speak about my later meeting with Dr. Martin and the amazing dinner we had, and then I'll begin to speak about more of our preaching activities in Africa and whatever stories I can remember. All right, Dandavat Pranam devotees, thanks for indulging me, and thanks for dealing with my inability to actually write this all, and that's due to a lack of time, facility, and many other things in my life at this time. But to be able to do the narration, and hopefully in the future to do some of these with some of those devotees who were prominent participants in the yatra there in Africa would be wonderful, especially Puja Pashal Bhaktivedanta Shanta Maharaj. All right, my Dandavat Pranam, Vancha Kalpaturuvescha, Kripa Shindavevacha, Patitanam, Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo, Namo Namo.